Okay, so today we're going to finish up with our discussion of what we want to get through of muscle before our next exam anyway. So quick announcement, you guys might have seen I posted the quiz 7 yesterday, so take until Wednesday to do that one. That's just on what we did last week. The purpose of that is to just make sure you have points other than your exam toward your lecture grade. I know everybody appreciates. Get a practice quiz for the exam up quite soon. Okay. So when we left off speaking about muscles, we talked about the structure of a muscle fiber. So we talked about these structures called sarcomeres that contract, allow us to contract our muscles overall and therefore to move loads. And we dove into the physiology of this a bit. So we dove into these ideas of excitation contraction coupling. So how we get a nervous impulse to our muscle, then cross-bridge cycling, how we actually allow our muscle cells to contract, how we actually shorten these sarcomeres. So what we're going to start out with today is I'm going to zoom out a little bit more and talk about this concept of a twitch. So now we're going to be thinking about these muscle fibers at kind of the larger level again. Okay. So a twitch just refers to the overall contraction that a muscle fiber produces in response to an action potential. So we have our action potential calming down our somatic nerve. We're releasing our neurotransmitter, which is, what neurotransmitter is it if we're talking about muscles? Yeah, exactly, acetylcholine. So at our neuromuscular junction, we have our receptors for acetylcholine, our nicotinic cholinergic receptors. Right, so we get that reaction, that end plate potential, that depolarization happening in our muscle fiber. We have that depolarization spreading down the sarcolemma, spreading down the T tubule, releasing calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum, binds to the troponin, pushing the tropomyosin off the myosin binding site on the axon, allowing our cross-bridge cycle to begin. So that whole process is what sets us up for the twitch. So a twitch is an all or nothing event. For a muscle fiber, either it contracts or it doesn't here. So we can define a twitch for the level of a muscle fiber, for the level of a motor unit. Remember, we have somatic nerves heading out of the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system. Then they're splitting. They're going to different muscle fibers. So if we have 2, 3, 4, 5 muscle fibers that ultimately are getting innervation from that same nerve, they form a unit because they're going to twitch at the same time together. Or we can think about a twitch at the level of the entire muscle. So when you measured in phys lab, when you're measuring muscle contraction, that would be at the level of the entire muscle. So twitch has phases. So we talked about phases of different things before. So kind of like we had phases of an action potential, now we have phases of a twitch. When we're thinking about a twitch, we're going to start out with something called the latent period. So the latent period is going to be the time it takes for an action potential to get into the muscle cell and to actually create contraction. So this latent period exists for about a few milliseconds. And this is really due to that excitation contraction coupling, right? Like it takes a little bit of time for our nicotinic cholinergic receptors to grab onto that acetylcholine, create our depolarization, our end plate potential in the muscle fiber, for that depolarization to spread down the sarcolemma and for us ultimately to release calcium into the cytosol. That takes some time. Our cross-bridge cycling isn't instantaneous, even once we get that impulse. So that's the latent phase. Second part of our twitch is the contraction phase. So our twitch builds in strength, builds in the amount of tension it's producing. And so the time it's increasing tension as our muscle fiber is shortening is our contraction phase. So the contraction is the actual physical shortening. This takes on the order of 10 to 100 milliseconds where we have this contraction. The cross-bridge cycling is happening during this contraction phase. Not happening during the latent period because we're still working on releasing that calcium is happening during the contraction phase. That's what's shortening our sarcomeres and therefore shortening the muscle. And then our cross-bridge cycling ceases, we enter the relaxation phase. So as start to remove calcium from the cytosol, as we're taking it back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, that means it's not present to bind to the troponin, which means that the tropomyosin slides back over those myosin binding sites on the actin. It means the cross bridges are breaking apart, they're not forming anymore, and our sarcomeres are going back to their original length. So during the relaxation phase, we're going to see the tension decreasing back to zero. This is going to take longer than a contraction phase, but no specific amount of time that you need to know here. So a twitch would look something like this. So here at the beginning is where we would have the stimulus. So since we're talking about a muscle fiber and a contraction, what do you think the stimulus is here? Our action potential from that neuron, right? The action potential coming from that somatic neuron releasing the acetylcholine, that is our stimulus, our direction to this muscle fiber that it needs to contract. So here at the stimulus is where we send that signal to our muscle fiber, and the latent period here where we're waiting for something to happen. Okay. So note that this is a graph of time and tension. The tension is just the force of contraction. Here we have it measured in grams, right? So we can see that during this latent period, no tension, no force is being generated. The circle part of the contraction phase, just to emphasize, but it's this flat part, right? We have no calcium, no cross bridges, so no tension, no shortening. So our contraction phase, right, the next up to 100 milliseconds, we see tension increasing. So we have cross bridges forming, we have more and more cross bridges forming, we're getting more and more overlap, right? So our thick and thin fibers are overlapping, we're using that power stroke to pull the actin towards the center of the sarcomere. So we're contracting more and more tension. And during our relaxation phase, while we're taking up calcium, so removing it from the cytosol, we're seeing our tension drop over time as these muscle fibers lengthen again. So when we talk about twitches, we sometimes refer to them as either isometric or isotonic twitches. Although when we think about movements in real life, we're going to see that we often have combinations of these two types of twitches. So isometric and isotonic twitches are going to be defined by what happens to the load that they're moving. So a load can be, right, like lifting something, right? So this would be our load, the force that we're exerting on the arm here. But a load can also be something that doesn't move, right? So if I grip this and I try to pull, this is also the load. So the load refers to the force at the piece that you're trying to move. And it may or may not be a movable element, it's just whatever is exerting that force. So when we're thinking about the isometric and isotonic twitches, I'm going to pay attention to our contractile elements, such as the thing that's actually shortening, the sarcomeres inside our myofibrils, inside our muscle cells. Since we're thinking potentially on a whole muscle level, you may also think about what we refer to as series elastic elements. So when you've seen muscles in lab, right, you've seen that the tendons at the end, for example, of our muscles, they're not pink anymore, they're white, they look different. They are histologically different. So connective tissue tendons at the ends of our muscles where they connect to bones don't have these same properties, these contractile properties. So it's really the muscle belly, like where you see the pink, where we have most of the contraction happening. But these elastic elements at the end will also allow some give and some stretch and some pull. So by definition, the tension that we're producing that we see on these graphs, that's the force that's exerted by the muscle as those sarcomeres are shortening, as those myofibrils overall are shortening, therefore as our muscle fibers are contracting. The load is the force that opposes that tension. So whatever we're lifting or whatever we're gripping and trying to move, even if we can't actually effectively move it. So when we think about an isometric twitch, an isometric twitch is one where the length of our muscle stays the same. Now, this doesn't mean that we don't have contraction. This means that like endpoint to endpoint, origin to insertion, like bone to bone, we're not shortening our overall muscle. But we are still going to generate tension. We are still going to have contraction of the units within the muscle fiber. So how do you think that can happen? So what would be happening if we have sarcomeres shortening, but the muscle isn't getting longer? Or sorry, the muscle isn't getting shorter. So what other element do we need to think about here? The load isn't moving yet, but that's a good thought, right? The load could move and that could allow us to shorten. In this case, in the isometric twitch, this is where we really have to pay attention to those tendons, those elastic elements. Because as the sarcomeres are shortening, right, so that muscle belly is punching up, right? You start to see potentially that bunched up muscle. But the overall end-to-end point isn't changing. So this is where we're going to see stretch in the tendons, right? Because to stay the same length, so say we have our muscle here, I'll make a tendon in blue, right? We're attached. Here's our bone in yellow, okay? So as we start to have our sarcomeres contracting, right? So they're going towards the center. All right, this means our muscle belly overall is going to look like it contracts. So we might start to see something right above, right, like this. All right, so the muscle is shorter. This part, the muscle belly, because the muscle fibers are contracting those sarcomeres. In order for the muscle as a whole not to shorten, this means that we have a lengthening here in those elastic elements. So this is the part that's getting longer. So if we compare when that would happen, if we want to predict when we have an isometric contraction, we're going to want to compare the load, so the force of whatever we're trying to lift, the force that's exerting on our body, versus the tension, which is the amount of force that the muscle is producing. So both of these could be measured as forces, both load and tension, basically. If we have more load, more force from that thing that we're trying to move, then we are able to create tension in the body. That's what creates this isometric twitch. In an isometric twitch, we can't lift the load because the load is too much for our muscle to produce tension. Let's try and think of some situations in which we see an isometric twitch. And we got some examples. I don't really know what calisthenics are, but probably. Or like if you're doing a plank or something, maybe, right? Like you feel that tension, but you're not moving, right? Something like that. Or potentially like posture. You actually are slightly contracting muscles to maintain posture. Right? That might be an isometric twitch, an isometric contraction. So we're contrasting this eventually with our isotonic. So here we can see what an experiment might look like if we were trying to measure an isometric contraction in a muscle that we've removed from some specimen. right? So we could fix both ends of our muscle to a bar, right? So here we have a bar we've attached at one end of the muscle, and here we have a force transducer, so somewhere we'd actually measure force. But if we hold this fixed, we stimulate this muscle, right, with some live wires, right, some electricity. You can do this. They have some creepy videos about stimulating like dead frogs with electricity. So this could be a real experiment. I would hold these two spots fixed, right? We would see that tension is generated in the muscle as the muscle belly gets shorter because those sarcomeres are contracting. And if we looked at the readout on our recorder from that force transducer, we see that our readout, we have, what's this phase called of the twitch? First part. The stimulus is here. So stimulus would be like the stimulator here. This first part is our, the latent phase. All right. And then we have what? What's this part? Yep, contraction, which gives us what here? Relaxation phase, right? So this is what we would see happening in an isometric contraction and an isometric twitch. So when we're looking at the phases of the twitch, our sort of stereotypical drawing of the phase of the twitch is of an isometric contraction. That's what it looks like. Now, this differs from an isotonic contraction, isotonic twitch. Because when we have an isotonic twitch, first thing, the tension that we're generating in our muscle is greater than the load. So now we're going to be able to actually move our load. Okay. So this means that for a big period of time during this twitch, the muscle is just going to generate the same amount of tension as it moves the load. Like it doesn't have to fight against this load and build as it tries to move. So we're going to see this point where we have a plateau, a constant tension generated. And the fact that this tension that we're generating with the muscle is greater than the load we're acting on means that the muscle gets to shorten, which is why we have actual movement. Right? So isotonic twitches are what we're going to see more in daily life, but their curves, when we look at the tension graph, are going to look a little different. So here we see the same kind of experiment. Now we can see they've labeled the load between the force transducer and our muscle. So we can see our muscle bunched up, right? Our sarcomeres contracted, went towards the center. In this case, our muscle actually got shorter. So instead of having those elastic elements stretch out, as we did in the isometric twitch, we actually moved the load. So that is where the distance changes, right? The actual load. So this means we can measure two things. We could measure how much did the muscle shorten or how much did the distance shorten. And like for our isometric twitch, we could measure the amount of tension. So what we see with the shortening, like here we have degree of shortening in millimeters, right? During our latent phase, right? We don't have any movement, we don't have any contraction. Then we start to shorten our muscle during the contraction. Okay. In this part, we're actually still kind of contracting and then we're relaxing. So we're letting this down, loosening up during our relaxation phase and back to the beginning. But our tension graph isn't going to be this nice curve, not this nice curve that we see at the top and not that nice curve that we saw for our isometric contraction. So we still see that latent phase at the beginning, right? So we still need time for that excitation contraction coupling, still need time for that calcium buildup. We still start to see this contraction bit, right? But then we have something happen. So what do you think is happening here at this corner? Why are we producing this corner? This is turning into a weird top hat thing. So remember what happens to the load during an isotonic contraction? What happens to that load? It moves, yeah. So this is where we're seeing that move happen, right? So we're building up the contraction, we're building up the force in the muscle as it starts to bunch up. But as we get more and more force, eventually that force is more than the load we're trying to move. So that's what's happened here, that we've started to actually move the load. So now the tension isn't building anymore because it doesn't have more and more opposition as we're building up. So that's why we have this plateau here. So here we have that plateau, and then we can see that that plateau is corresponding to the shortening here, right? So it's corresponding to this actual shortening of the distance as the load is lifted. So this force is kind of going into this overall shortening of the muscle and lifting of the load, but it doesn't have to keep increasing as it keeps lifting. So in normal muscle activity, sometimes we have purely isometric contractions. Rarely do we have purely isotonic contractions. Usually we see kind of a combination of these two. So usually the way it's going to work is we're going to start out with an isometric contraction. So we're going to start out with a tension produced by the muscle that isn't big enough to move our load, right? We're going to start to push something. It doesn't immediately start moving, right? So we start to build up to this isometric contraction. And then we'll enter the isotonic phase where we have a load that is movable because we have more tension in our muscle. So think about it kind of like opening a heavy door, right? You have to like kind of push and then you overcome it and it frees and maybe you open the door too quickly. So we usually have isometric, then isotonic. The isometric continues until that tension exceeds the load, at which point we have the movement. Another thing that is true, and this gets kind of complicated, we're not going to be tracking really these changes in load, but it is the case that loads depend on lever arms and distances. So actually, as you move a load, right, pick something on your desk, right? Like it feels a different amount of heaviness if it's out here versus if it's here. Right? That's because it is exerting different amounts of force on you. Position matters. That's why like pulleys work, or why they have those weird straps for potentially lifting couches and things like that. So as a limb position changes, as your arm moves or whatever limb we're talking about, whatever muscle we're talking about, we're changing the distance from the point about which we're moving, so usually it's the joint. And this is going to change the load. So if you were to, in real life, make graphs about load versus tension versus shortening, it might look not exactly like those little stereotypical ones we just looked at. There would be some more variables here. Now, when we talk about muscle fibers as generating force, we're usually not just thinking about, right, like one sarcomere or like one tiny little twitch. We're going to think about how tension kind of builds and how some muscle fibers are going to be stronger and create more force, more tension, more contraction than others. So when we're thinking about these different amounts of force we can produce, one of the things we're going to think about is properties of the muscle fiber itself. So the muscle fiber containing those myofibrils, containing the sarcomeres, containing these cross bridges. Okay. If we have more cross bridges forming, okay, like if we're grabbing onto the actin with our myosin and pulling more times, we're going to exert more force because we're going to have more contraction because we have more cross bridge cycling happening. So that's one way we can increase the force here that a muscle fiber exerts. Another way we can do it is we can contract more fibers, right? So that's when we get into thinking kind of about the motor units when we think about muscles exerting force. So if we're looking at these tension graphs some more, we'll notice some details of some sort of stereotypical kind of graphs we might produce. So one thing that is true, so say we start to send impulses to a muscle. We're going to send the same stimulus just a bunch of times. So you see the same pink arrow over and over again. So that's our action potential coming down, zapping our muscle, right? So the muscle is going to have some characteristic responses to the stimulus being applied over and over again. So the first thing we're going to note is we're going to see this thing called treppy, right? So treppy is the fact that every time we're producing the stimulus, right, producing this contraction, you see the first time we went to this peak and then went all the way down. But the next time we have that same stimulus, we're creating a stronger contraction the second time, right? So this goes up and up and up with subsequent stimuli until we reach a plateau. Okay. So this increase in response to the same stimulus is called treppy. And this likely has something to do with the calcium release and amount of calcium release in response to these consecutive stimuli. But I do want you to note that in this example, we are going back to our baseline between them, because that's going to help us distinguish it from our concept of summation. Okay, so notice that we're building the amount of tension. All right, 1, 2, 3. We're getting higher and higher until we reach this plateau. But we are fully relaxing here in this example. Next, we're going to talk about summation. So summation is going to have to do with consecutive stimuli as well. But now we're going to think about stimuli that are overlapping in time. So we remember from our discussion of neurons, right, that action potentials are all or nothing. We don't have little action potentials versus big action potentials. Just an action potential is an action potential is an action potential. But they can come closer together. That's the one way we can vary these signals. We can space our action potentials apart, or we can tack them close together, so long as we are mindful of that refractory trace, the action potential. Okay. We can have an action potential taking 2 milliseconds, and then we have a contraction for the next 10 to 200 milliseconds. But this means that we could get several action potentials coming through while we are still contracting that muscle. Now, if we have another action potential come in while the muscle is still in this process of contracting, our contractions are going to sum together and we're going to get more force generated. We're going to create more tension. So here we see that twitch, that curve happening, right? So here we see that action potential in the latent period. And we see our contraction, right, and our relaxation. So that's that same twitch from before. If we look at summation, so here we see that first twitch beginning. As we look at summation, so our pink arrows are still action potentials, right? So we have one action potential come in. And here we're contracting, or even entering the relaxation phase. But we have another action potential come in before we're back to baseline. So before our tension falls to 0, and this is why I was pointing out the difference with treppy, right? Because otherwise it looks like this continuing increase, right? It looks very similar. But if we have another action potential come in before we've finished relaxing, so we still have some cross bridges, we still have some shortening of those sarcomeres. We have another action potential come in, so we release more calcium. So we do it again. But because we hadn't gotten rid of all that calcium in the first place, now there's more calcium when we hit that peak. So we have our tension. So that's summation. Now the next thing we'll start to see as we sum and sum and sum, just like in the treppy, we saw that we were going up and up and up. There is a maximum amount of tension that a muscle can produce. So we'll start to see this plateau. We can see that we're only going down to here. Eventually, no matter how fast we have our action potentials come in, we're at the maximum amount of force that this muscle can generate. Right, so we're at this plateau. But we're not dipping down anymore. We don't see any wiggle up and down because as we start to fall away, we immediately have more calcium here. So we're kind of at the maximum amount of calcium here and we're saturating our cross bridges with the calcium. So that's what tetanus is. So tetanus refers to this locked kind of state of the muscle. If you've heard of like tetanus, the disease, this kind of causes this locked state of muscles, or like lockjaw or something like that. Causes this buildup of calcium and this contraction of the muscle that doesn't relax. If we're looking at the fiber level of the muscles, so not the action potentials anymore, but the fibers themselves, different fibers are going to have different force generating capacity. Okay. And this is going to basically depend on how big they are. So sarcomere is pretty much the same, but it is true that we can have more sarcomeres. If we have more sarcomeres and more cross bridges, this means we're going to have more force. So we could do this by having multiple myofibrils in parallel, right? So we remember that our sarcomeres are structured. Got our V line, got our actin. We have our myosin, M line, A band, and their end to end, right? Okay. So these are how the sarcomeres go in one myofibril, right? But we could stick another one just alongside, right? So we could have one over here. Right. So that would mean that that fiber would be able to create more force as we have two kind of running in parallel. You could also create more force if we have more cross bridges. So we're going to talk about the fact that muscles have an optimal position from which they work. And that has to do with the cross bridges that they can form. The typical way we're going to see more force generated by a specific muscle is we're going to see that the muscle fiber is greater in diameter. So it's like wider, fatter, thicker. And the reason for that is that more sarcomeres in parallel, so more myofibrils next to each other, does generate more force. But there are only so many that you can fit in an amount of area. The spacing between the thick and thin filaments is constant. So in order to fit more sarcomeres in parallel, to fit more things next to each other, the muscle fiber has to be physically wider in order to fit that. So we can't just like kind of pack them extra close together. We have to actually have a larger cell. So if we have a larger diameter fiber, we have more filaments, which means there are more sarcomeres in parallel, which means we have more force. So the fiber length, like the amount of kind of stretch that the muscle is at the beginning of a contraction, is going to affect the amount of force that that muscle can generate. Like your muscles are going to be more effective in certain starting positions than others, which probably if you try to do some exercises in your room or at the gym, like you can feel like it's easier to start lifting from certain positions than others. Right. So this is because every muscle has an optimal length where the actin and the myosin in the sarcomeres are overlapping the optimal amount. Now, in your daily life, your muscles are positioned such that most of them start out at optimal length, but you can stretch your muscles into non-optimal positions, which is going to impact their ability to generate tension and their ability to generate force. Okay. Now, this can be a muscle that's stretched out too much, that's at a greater length than optimum, or a fiber that's at a lesser degree of tension and a shorter length than optimum. Both of these affect the physical position of those thin and thick filaments, so that actin and myosin in the sarcomeres, in ways that affect the cross-bridge cycle. So when we have a greater length than optimum, so like a muscle that's stretched out more than it should be, this means that we don't have enough cross bridges, so enough myosins kind of overlapping the actin. So they're not able to grab onto as much actin, and so they can't pull as much. So that's the way in which that is going to be able, or that is the way in which that's going to impact force generation. On the opposite end, if we have a muscle that's like too bunched up, we're actually going to start to see the actin, the thin filaments overlapping each other. To remember, in our normal basic sarcomere, right, there are those Z lines there at the end, they're not overlapping at all. Now, if we try to contract a muscle where they're super close together, and you're trying to pull the actin past the actin, that's not very effective either. So the Z lines are going to kind of come into contact with the thick filaments. And since neither the actin nor the myosin changes length, it's like they're kind of bumping into each other and they're physically not going to be able to shorten in the same way. So those affect the amount of force, and we layer on top of that our understanding of summation and tetanus, which has to do with the fact that we are generating different amounts of force also because of the amounts of calcium that are in the cytosol because we've had subsequent stimuli. So the summation and the tetanus are usually because we have calcium still bound to the troponin. And if we're getting a lot of action potentials over and over again really fast, the calcium higher in the cytosol and the release of that calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum is faster than the sarcoplasmic reticulum is soaking back up calcium, so faster than reuptake. It means we have saturation of the system with calcium. So when all the troponin has calcium bound to it, that means that the cross-bridge cycling gets maxed out. That's going to be the maximum contraction of that muscle fiber, also known as our maximum tetanic contraction. So here we can see a comparison of like that tension graph to what the sarcomere looks like at these different lengths. So I find this helpful for understanding that optimal length concept. So our optimal length here is labeled as our normal length. So that's this bit in green here. So what we can see, right, you can see here that this looks like our usual sarcomere, right? So that was our set state where we had our sarcomere. We can see our Z lines, we can see that actin in blue, we can see the myosin here in orange, we can see that H zone, that bare zone in the center here. We can see that when it's shortened toward the other end of the green, right, our sarcomere has done its normal shortening, we get to the point where we've pulled the actin as far into the center as we can, right? And then we're stopping here. So that's where we ideally want to be for our maximum force generation. This is where you normally will be spending your time. Now, what's happening here in our decreased length first, so let's look here at the too small, too bunched up, too crunched together zone. All right, so what we can see happening, like if we try to contract our muscle when we're already at this shortened state, right? So we contracted, I'm trying to contract some more. As we try to do that, this forces overlap between the actin, right? So that already looks weird, right? Not what we expect our sarcomeres to do in the first place. The other thing we can see, right, is that like I band that we usually have, right? That zone where we have actin, but not myosin. It's disappeared here, right? So this is really that myosin bumping into the Z line, right? So there's a certain point at which we cannot go any further. We cannot crunch any smaller. The other side is a little harder to see what's going on here. But basically here, when we start out in our optimal zone, you can see that we have all of these cross bridges, all of those heads, so all of those actin binding sites on the myosin do actually have some actin next to them to grab onto, right? So they could actually pull on something. But if we're too far out, if we're too long, right, these ones could grab on to the actin. But this one out here, right, like no matter how much it tries to form a cross bridge, there's no actin next to it. It doesn't have anything to grab. So it's not going to be able to generate as much force because it's too stretched out in this way. And you can really emphasize that over here, right? We only have overlap here between that bit of the myosin head, and none of these have any actin, any thin filament to grab onto. So no matter how much calcium we have there, right, if you don't have the binding sites to bind together, you're not going to be able to contract together as well. So finally, when we're talking about the global scale of like a big named muscle, big named muscles are made up of many muscle cells, so many muscle fibers. If we contract more muscle fibers, we're going to overall create greater force. Now, here's where we think about our motor units. So our motor units, we have our somatic nerve splitting, going to several different muscle fibers. So each muscle fiber, if you trace it back to the spine, would be going to only one nerve. Okay. So this is not that dual innervation between sympathetic and parasympathetic. This is like the opposite of that, just has the one motor fiber. Okay. So in recruitment, we have a progressive kind of contraction, a progressive recruitment of motor units. So some muscle fibers are going to get targeted first. So some muscle fibers are always going to be the first ones to contract. And then as you want to generate more and more force, you're going to scale up and grab bigger and bigger muscle units, motor units, basically. So our motor units, right, here we can see what I mean. We have the motor unit spreading out to muscle fibers. But if we look at any one muscle fiber, right, this muscle fiber is only getting innervation from motor unit Y. This muscle fiber is only getting innervation from motor unit X. So we'd never have, for example, X send an impulse, but Y respond, right? A muscle fiber is only controlled by one of those. Right. So here you can see the progression of recruitment here. So when we start out, if we have only X fire, we would only get those 5 fibers corresponding to X contracting. So we can see how much tension that produces. You can see Y is a slightly bigger motor unit. So if we contracted Y, we get 7 fibers, so slightly more tension. But if we contract X and Y together, that's what gets us a nice big force. Right? So as we contract more motor units, we get more force. So when we activate a motor neuron, we can't control, like, if a motor unit contains 5 fibers, all 5 fibers are going to contract when that neuron goes off, right? So we can't have neuron X, I think it was, that went to 5 fibers. We can't have motor neuron X only activate 3 of those 5. It just does or doesn't activate the motor fibers. Okay, so it's going to activate its whole unit when it fires. So the increase in tension is increasing because of the size of the motor units and the fact that we are progressively recruiting more and more motor units. So as you saw in like your second phys lab or something like that, you talked about the motor units and how they have different sizes. So when we're trying to do little delicate movements, we're just going to be activating little small motor units, and that gives us a lot of precision, but not that much force. Whereas when we want to have big, powerful movements, we're going to expect to see a lot of larger motor units with lots of big fat muscle fibers so that we can have these really strong contractions and create big, powerful movements. So there's kind of a trade-off between tension and precision. The number of motor units in any named muscle is going to vary, and the size of them is going to vary. So small ones for delicate movements, large ones for big movements. And their fiber diameters also vary. So weak movements are going to have small fiber diameters, so not as many sarcomeres in parallel, not as many myofibrils. And the big, large, fat ones for stronger movements are going to be large in diameter as well. The order of recruitment is progressive by size. So you'd activate those small little delicate motor fibers and then also the large units if you were trying to say, you know, with your fingers, right? Like I've been rock climbing a lot recently, right? Like I could grab a pencil, but sometimes, you know, I'll have to exert a bunch of force there to lift myself up, right? So you would still activate those small units that you use for precision first, and then also larger units within that same muscle. Larger neurons are more difficult to depolarize the threshold. So we saw a little bit about how action potential changes based on how wide those neurons were in our last unit. So part of the reason those large units contract later is that you need a little more synaptic input, you need a little more depolarization to get them there. So this is just a diagram of what that might look like, that building recruitment. So this is just called the size principle, saying to do the small one first. So on Wednesday, we will just be reviewing for our exam, which will be on Friday. And then we'll basically be ready for Thanksgiving.